Hey everyone, it's Chevy. Fontaine's patrol captain Chevreuse has her musket loaded and ready to arrest enemies. She brings an interesting set of mechanics to the table, so to help you learn how to build and play her, this guide will cover her kit and talents, constellations, best artifact and weapon builds, teams, and more. Let's begin. Chevreuse is a 4-star Pyro polearm user with a kit focused on using overload teams to buff Pyro and Electro damage while adding more buffing and healing support utilities. She's mainly a support unit, but there's also some potential to build her for damage, especially with Constellations. Let's investigate her kit details and see how she works. We'll start with her Ascension 1 passive, which is Chevreuse's most unique aspect, and clarify some potential misconceptions regarding its purpose. In summary, if the team is made up of only Electro and Pyro units, then whenever a party member triggers an overload reaction, enemies affected will have their Pyro and Electro resistances reduced by 40% for 6 seconds. While this might make players assume that she's a direct parallel to Nilou, that's not exactly the case, and I also want to establish their important difference. They're similar in that their elemental restrictions unlock their reaction-related buffs. However, Nilou directly buffs and transforms Bloom cores into Bountiful cores to make them explode stronger and faster. Meanwhile, Chevreuse does not directly buff Overload itself. Instead, she makes Overload reduce Pyro and Electro resistance, which in turn makes Overload damage stronger since it's technically Pyro damage. But more than that, Chevreuse is also boosting the raw damage of Pyro and Electro units, whereas Nilou doesn't really buff Dendro and Hydro damage unless you have her C2. So in fact, Chevreuse is actually first and foremost a Pyro and Electro damage buffer who relies on overloads, and it just so happens that Overload also enjoys the same damage boosting benefits. In a way, she's like a Viridescent Veneer set's 4-piece effect, which compensates her Pyro-Electro team's restriction to slot in Anemo units. This also means that the main damage source of Chevreuse's teams are still Pyro and Electro damage, not overload reactions, and that you're not expected to go full EM on Chevreuse or her teammates. It's not the same for Nilou's team, where Bountiful cores are the most significant damage source of her teams. With that clarified, let's move on to the rest of her kit. Her normal attacks are a 4-hit combo with a lunging charged attack. However, these are only physical attacks, and you won't really use them as much since Chevreuse's main damage sources are her skill and burst anyway, and she'll mainly be a quick swap unit. With her skill, it has a press and hold version. Pressing it will cause her to instantly fire her musket at the nearest target, dealing AoE pyro damage that scales on her attack. Meanwhile, holding it will enter her aiming mode and allow her to fire an overcharged ball, which deals bigger AoE pyro damage. A ball charge is obtained when a party member triggers overload shown by the icon beside her, and she can only have one overcharged ball at a time. So at the start of battle, don't forget to trigger an overload reaction first to load her ball up. While in her aiming mode, she also seems to have added interruption resistance, which is pretty nice to make her feel less vulnerable. Afterwards, she heals the active character every 2 seconds for 12 seconds, and the healing amount scales on her max HP. While the healing is generally fine for many scenarios with some dodging and iframing, the healing value isn't very high, and its single target nature can be limiting, so you should still exercise some caution if Chevreuse is your only sustained support in the team. Additionally, when you unlock her Ascension 4 passive, firing an overcharged ball will buff the attack of Pyro and Electro teammates based on her HP. That's 1% attack for every 1000 HP, maxing at 40% attack with 40,000 HP. The buff lasts for 30 seconds, so as long as you consistently fire her overcharged ball, you can treat it as a permanent buff. Because of this, stacking her HP has double the purpose, boosting her healing and team attack buff values. For her burst, she fires a projectile that deals attack scaling AoE damage, then the projectile splits into secondary explosive shells. These shells will explode quickly after for smaller instances of pyro damage. Since the shells are positioned in a circle around the enemies, their explosions can throw lighter enemies towards the circle center, offering some minor crowd control utility to keep them in place. As for her rotation, it's possible to skill then burst to let her catch her own particles, or you can use her burst then skill to funnel her particles to another teammate, and if you're trying to trigger an overload reaction first for her skill's overcharged ball. But if you have her C4, then you'll most likely want to use her burst first. She also decreases sprinting stamina consumption as her exploration passive. For her talent priority, level up her skill first as it increases both her damage and healing multiplier, followed by her burst, which only increases its damage. You can leave her normal attacks alone to save resources, unless you're doing some very specific stuff with it, like Bennett's Pyro Infusion. So to recap, at C0, Chevreuse's main function is consolidating the role of healer, buffer, and elemental resistance shredder for Pyro and Electro teams. This means that where you would typically slot in Bennett and/or an Anemo VV user, Chevreuse is a viable substitute. Chevreuse gives decent healing, but it's low and slow enough that you still want to be careful with dodging enemy attacks. Her passive doesn't offer as much of an attack buff as Bennett does, but she at least doesn't limit you to staying in a circle field, and her attack buff can easily have permanent uptime. Then, compared to a VV Anemo user, remember that the VV set effect has to swirl the element while the user is on field to shred the elemental resistance for 10 seconds. By contrast, Chevreuse enables you to reduce enemy elemental resistance without having to be on field, and though hers only lasts 6 seconds, your team just needs to keep proccing overload reactions. In specific cases, some bosses that have innate auras like the Thunder Manifestation and Hydrotulpa can only be swirled by more advanced methods like Guoba swirling, but Chevreuse offers a very easy way to reduce their resistance. That doesn't mean she fully replaces a VV Anemo unit though, since Anemos typically come with additional functions like strong crowd control and/or other buffs. So at C0, her contributions may not completely replace Bennett or a VV Anemo, nor be as potent as them, but at least she does an okay job at consolidating those roles with some added conveniences. That's just her base kit though, so let's see what she gains with her Constellations. With C1, when you're using her in a Pyro-Electro team and an active character, except Chevreuse, triggers overload, they will instantly recover 6 energy with a 10-second cooldown limitation. This can help a little bit with energy needs, but I generally recommend to still build your party with sufficient ER that doesn't rely on this extra energy gain. For C2, using her hold skill and hitting a target will create 2 chain explosions near the target which deal additional pyro damage. This is considered elemental skill damage and has a 10-second cooldown as well. The explosions also throw light enemies, which might also keep them somewhat in place for minor crowd controlling. C3 increases her skill level, which means more skill damage and, more importantly, better healing. C4 sort of adds additional charges to her skill. After casting her burst, firing her hold skill will not immediately start its cooldown, and it'll still take effect even if you swap her out. The cooldown will instead start either after 6 seconds or once you fire her hold skill 2 more times. Unfortunately, the extra skills won't generate additional pyro particles due to particle ICD. They will, however, refresh and extend her healing timer since it will last for 12 seconds after she fires her last hold skill. This also gives Chevreuse additional damage potential, especially if she has an overcharged ball with each shot. But maybe the most amusing perk of this is her consecutive voice lines.
Hands where I can see them! Drop your weapons! Final warning! Drop your weapons!
C5 increases her burst level by 3. And finally, C6 has 2 effects. First, after 12 seconds of her skill's healing effect, your entire party also gets 1 additional tick of healing equal to 10% of her max HP. It's a way for her to gain off-field healing, but more importantly, it helps trigger the second effect of her C6. Now, after a party member is healed by Chevreuse's skill, they gain a 20% Pyro and Electro damage bonus for 8 seconds, which can stack 3 times, and each stack has an independent duration. It depends on your rotation and field time distribution how the healing ticks and bonuses will be allocated, while the added team-wide healing will guarantee at least everyone gets 1 later on. Naturally, an on-field DPS will have the most opportunity to maximize the buff. This is her most significant constellation in enhancing her support utilities, as Chevreuse becomes a much more potent buffer, providing resistance shred, attack buffs, and damage bonus buffs. Her C6 elevates her kit to be more competitive with other buffers, and she can somewhat fulfill a similar function to Kazuha, offering both resistance shred and now damage bonus to party members. However, she does lose the stronger grouping abilities of Anemo units, but at least that frees up such units for a different team. Now we can move on to Chevreuse's artifact builds. Let's start with her support healer build. For her main stats, you're mainly going for a full HP build. Minor variations could be if you're using an ER Sands instead if you're severely lacking ER, a healing bonus circlet if you want better healing, or a crit rate circlet if using a Favonius Lance and you're lacking crit rate substats. 40,000 HP will be your cap for converting her HP into an attack buff for Pyro and Electro teammates, but anything past that will at least still increase her healing ticks. For substats, you mainly want ER and HP, and crit rate if using a Fav Lance. Her ER targets are quite manageable and achievable through substats, especially if using a weapon that helps generate energy. When it comes to support sets, I recommend the 4-piece Noblesse for its team-wide attack buff, or the 4-piece Exile set, which gives her teammates some energy back. However, the 4-piece Exile is only limited to 4-star quality, so it has a lower stat ceiling. For a cheap and flexible build, you can just go for 2-piece combos of ER, HP, or healing bonus sets. Healing-related sets are an option, though I don't recommend them them as much anymore. Maiden's Beloved is already too much healing, her on-field healing isn't as suited to the Ocean-Hued Clam, and the Song of Days Past buff generally loses out to the 4-piece Noblesse's attack buff. The Instructor set also isn't as recommended anymore, as the Noblesse's attack buff is just generally better for overall damage. If you're aiming for a DPS focused build, which becomes more viable at C4, then her main stats will be an attack Sans, pyro damage goblet, and crit circlet. Look for crit and attack substats as well as enough ER to burst every rotation. Her healing becomes much less potent here, but it won't be a problem if you have another healer on the team like Bennett. However, if she's going to be your only sustain unit, then some HP stats can be nice. For artifacts, you can go for more efficient and flexible 2-piece combos of Crimson Witch, Golden Troop, Attack, Emblem, or Noblesse sets. With good substats, these are quite competitive with 4-piece sets. But for higher potential, 4-piece Emblem gives a significant burst damage bonus on top of helping her ER needs. 4-piece Golden Troop is another strong option, especially with her C4, as it gives a huge skill buff. But note that part of the skill buff expires after the wearer has been on field for 2 seconds, so if you want to maximize the buff with her multiple skills at C4, you can swap out after her burst or between skills to refresh the max buff. There's also the 4-piece Crimson Witch of Flames, which gives a pyro damage bonus and buffs pyro-related reactions. You can further increase the pyro damage bonus by using the skill, and with her C4, you can now cast it consecutively for a higher bonus. Unfortunately, the 4-piece Marechaussee Hunter is harder to utilize if she's the only healer, since the crit rate buff has to be stacked on field and her heal ticks are slow. Taking damage could expedite it, but it would be inconsistent to rely on that, so I overall don't recommend it as much. Moving on to her weapons, again starting with her support healer build. The Favonius Lance is a highly recommended weapon that allows her to further battery the team by generating white particles. The extra energy for the team allows you to aim for lower ER stats on everyone and allocate more towards offensive stats. Having some crit rate substats on Chevreuse can help this proc more reliably, and with refinements, it's possible to proc this more than once in a rotation. My next recommended and thankfully free alternative is the Rightful Reward, which is Fontaine's craftable pole arm. It has an HP substat which is great for her healing and attack buff, and an energy giving passive after being healed, making it a nice middle point between HP and energy needs. The Kitane Crossspear is another craftable with an energy-related passive, but the substat is EM. Between the two, I'd generally recommend Rightful Reward. Otherwise, the Black Tassel gives a high HP substat, and being a 3-star weapon means it's very cheap to build. You'll just need to get enough ER stats from either her artifact substats or Sans piece. Then for a DPS build, she'll basically want weapons that have attack and crit substats. It's also a plus if they have damage bonus passives. With Chevreuse's team comps, her default setup is obviously a Pyro-Electro only team to trigger her passive. However, I'll also touch on her teams that have other elements, and even if that disables her passive, there are still ways to make it work if you really want to. Before getting into teammate options, let's quickly discuss the characteristics of a Pyro-Electro team. The only reaction available to a Pyro-Electro team is Overload, not counting if enemies have innate auras or any environmental elemental application. Enemies with a Hydro aura, like the Hydro Tulpa, are special, since they can first be electrocharged and then overloaded while the electro aura is still present. One concern of overload is that it knocks back light enemies, which can cause you to waste time chasing them or even missing some attacks because they're no longer right in front of you. As such, overload can feel better against bosses or heavier enemies that can't be thrown around. Overload also deals AoE pyro damage, so it can be more effective in AoE scenarios. Another thing to note is that these Pyro-Electro teams will generally rely on the raw damage of your units, with the overload triggers being supplementary damage only. So you basically don't want to force EM builds on units if it's not natural to them. Given that Chevreuse specializes in Pyro-Electro teams, that pretty much streamlines our character options. Within those elements, we have a good choice of on-field and off-field damage dealers, as well as offensive and defensive supports, so you have room to experiment with what teammate combos will give you the balance of damage and comfort that you prefer. The two current limited banner characters fortunately have good synergies with Chevreuse. With Raiden, you can make her a hypercarry team with Chevreuse and others buffing Raiden's damage alone, which is also conveniently her current banner. Alternatively, you can also mix her with other DPS units like Xiangling, Fischl, or Yae, in which case Chevreuse can take the support slot of Bennett, an Anemo unit, or Sarah, or she can be your only buffer since she buffs the entire team already anyway. As for Yoimiya, while she's typically used in vaporized team variations, a pure overload team still works. She doesn't strictly have to maintain her attack combo since she's not trying to vape certain hits anymore, so dodging with her here isn't as much of a damage loss, and you can forgo a shielder teammate. This allows you to prioritize off-field damage dealers and/or more offensive supports, but if you want more comfort, you can always slot in other defensive supports. I also spent a bit of time with Linny, as Chevreuse fits the bill for his standard triple pyro team. Going in without a dedicated shielder can feel risky, as it leaves him vulnerable to stagger while charging his shots, but it's still definitely doable as long as you're careful. Xiangling is usually glued to Bennett for the pyro particles and snapshotting his attack buff, but in teams with Raiden or triple pyro, Xiangling's energy needs are manageable even if you replace Bennett with Chevreuse. Of course, Chevreuse doesn't necessarily have to be the only support, as you can still combine her with other supports like Bennett or Sarah, but if she's your only support, at least she already consolidates healing and buffing. And if you have her Constellations, that can give her more damage potential, so you can skew her role more towards a sub-DPS support role at the expense of lowering her team-wide attack buff and healing potential. As an overall note though, many Electro and Pyro DPSs are generally more recommended and stronger in teams that have better suited reactions for them, like Keqing in Aggravate, Hu Tao in Double Hydro Vape, Sino in Quick Bloom, and so on. Still, Chevreuse's Overload team simplifies team building and reaction management, and at the end of the day, a well-invested team is more than capable of clearing the hardest content. For any future Pyro or Electro characters, at least Chevreuse offers a viable team archetype, but she might also be laying the groundwork for future characters who will not just work in an Overload team, but actually be most optimal in such teams. But that's something we'll have to wait for and see. Now, you can technically still play Chevreuse in teams that aren't exclusively Pyro-Electro. While this deactivates her A1 passive, which gets rid of her 40% Pyro and Electro resistance shred, remember that her attack buff can still activate as long as you have another Electro unit to help trigger an overload for an overcharged ball. And if you have her C6, its damage bonuses will still work since it's based on her healing. For example, an Overload Vaporize or Overvape team brings in a Hydro with consistent Hydro application. Hydro and Electro combined will keep an Electro charged aura on the enemy, which can enable vaporizes alongside overloads when pyro is applied. Another possibility is just by slotting in a VV Animo unit in an overload team, who can then provide the resistance shred and even stack other buffs alongside Chevreuse's attack and C6 buffs. You could also have her buff Electro units in a quicken comp, like in this team with Sino, Fischl, and Nahida, so it's much better if Chevreuse is already C6, so that Sino's and Fischl's aggravates can make use of her damage bonus buffs. What about other reaction teams like Melt or Vaporize, for example? Trying to use Chevreuse in teams or situations that don't proc overload will lower her overall potential, since she won't be able to load her overcharged ball and activate her attack buff. Remember also that only Pyro and Electro teammates can make use of her attack and C6 buffs, so unless she has another Pyro or Electro teammate, her buffs will be underutilized. Teams without overload will be less suited to Chevreuse's skill set, but as always, feel free to experiment. And that's it for this Chevreuse guide. Let me know in the comments what you think of her, and if you pulled a copy of her on these banners. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!
Not bad. I feel my aim getting steadier by the minute.